So in Python, one of the interesting things is that for loops, there's only two types of loops. You have the while loops and you have the for loops. So the for loops are how you're going to iterate through sets, so lists, dictionaries, those types of things. And then whenever else you're going to need a loop, you're simply going to be using a while loop. So there's other programming languages that have while loops and do while loops. They have numerous different ways of being able to do loops in order to process data. The important thing to understand with Python is basically you get the while loop unless you're iterating through a set of some sort. So when you do the while loop, essentially the while loop is going to continue until a condition is met. So there's things called comparison operators, and so in equals, so equals means that two things are equal, right? If variable equals 1, then break the loop. It's equal. Sometimes people forget and they put equal. So equal assigns the value to something. Equals tests if the values are the same. Exclamation point equals means not equal. So basically it's true when the two things are not equal. There's less than, there's greater than, there's less than or equal to, or greater than or equal to. Now it is important, especially when you're doing things like while loops, that you keep the greater than and less than or equal to in mind, because if you're going to loop until, let's say, 10, so you say, I want to do this loop 10 times, we're going to start with 1 and we're going to stop with 10. Well, if you say while variable or whatever is less than 10, that means it'll stop at 9. Because 10 isn't less than 10, 10 is equal to 10, so it'll stop at 9. So you have to say less than or equal to 10 to get it all the way up to that 10 number. The same thing as if you're trying to count down. If you're trying to get down to 0, right, if you say greater than 0, then it'll stop at 1, because 1 is greater than 0, but 0 obviously is not greater than 0, so you need to be greater than or equal to 0 in order to get those to actually be true. Now when you're incrementing or decrementing through the iteration of a loop in Python, you're going to use either plus equals, most likely 1, or minus equals, most likely 1. So in other programming languages you have plus plus or minus minus. So you have the variable name. So let's say you're keeping track of how many times you've run a loop. Every time you run the loop you increment a variable by 1. So you might have var plus plus, and so basically what var plus plus does in other languages is it takes the current value of the variable, it adds 1 to it, then assigns that total back to the variable to increment it. Or minus minus, it decreases the variable by 1, and that's how you do incrementation. In the Python world, you're going to do plus equals 1 or minus equals 1. So the variable name plus equals 1 will take the variable, it will add 1 to the variable, and it will assign that total back to the variable, and that's how you're able to increment within Python. So here's a very simple example of a while loop. The first thing is you need a variable that you're testing against. So in the real world, this variable that you're testing against might come from a database or may come from a user or that type of thing. We're just going to create it here. And basically with this particular loop, all we're going to do is we're going to loop through 10 times and we're going to count out to 10. Again, a very simple thing. So we create a variable called number and we're going to assign it the value of 1. So number is going to equal 1. While num is less than or equal to 10, colon, we're simply going to print out the value of num. So when it goes through the first time, it'll be 1. Then num plus equals 1. So the value of num plus 1 is going to be 2, and now we're going to assign the value 2 back to num. So when this loops through, it'll test, it's still less than or equal to 10. We're going to print out 2, then we're going to add 1, so it'll be 3, 4, 5, so on and so forth. So we go and we actually go to run this. We can see that this is basically all that happens is it loops through, and it's going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 until it gets to 10. Now again, the important thing with this less than or equal to is if we only put less than there, we don't put the equal to, and we run this, we will see it stops at 9 because 9 is less than 10. 10 obviously isn't less than 10. So this is the basic idea of how a while loop works, and it's one of those things you're going to be using a lot in the Python world. So here's a little bit of code that's a little bit more dynamic, I suppose. Basically, this is kind of like a repayment calculator, give you the idea of how this works. So we have a debt. So essentially, how much money have you taken out as a loan from somebody? And then we have a payment of how much are you going to be paying per every time you make a payment, right? So the entire debt here is 100. The payment is going to equal 15. And so we're just trying to figure out how long it will take to repay this debt. So while debt is greater or equal to 0, so as long as this is above 0, we're going to print out what the current debt is. And then we're going to say debt equals the current value of debt minus the payment, and then it's going to loop through it. It's going to keep looping through while it's greater than or equal to 0. So if we're going to pay $15 payments towards a $100 debt, it's going to go through. Initially, it's going to be a $100 debt, then 85, 70, 55, 40, 25, 10. And so it takes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It'll take 7 payments to pay off that debt. If we go here and let's say we plug in 25 instead, then we run this, we can see it's going to take, whether 4 or 5 payments. I'm bad with the math. It's going to take so many payments to be able to pay off that particular debt. And so this gives you a little bit more of a dynamic example of how you can use this while loop to start trying to do some calculations. Now the last thought before we get on to the next module is just make sure you do not overthink loops in the Python world. Other programming languages have much more sophisticated, complicated, interesting loops that you can do. Again, Python literally tries to be a simple programming language, both to be able to read and to be able to write. And so when they do their loops, it's a lot more simple than some of these other languages. So just don't overthink the while loops and you should be fine.